Good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever in the world you are joining from. Welcome to this session on deep dive about hybrid mail flow. My name is Hien Nguyen. I'm a cloud solution architect in the mission critical team for Microsoft, and I'll be presenting today's session. So, just a few things about myself. I'm from Sydney, Australia, so it's pretty early here. It's 6 a.m. In the east coast of Australia. I have a son who keeps me busy and awake at this time as well, so I'm pretty used to being awake this early. I play the drums, bit of volleyball, and I've been in Microsoft since August 2017 in the mission critical team. That's my alias, hienguy@microsoft.com, and I've worked with Exchange since 2003. Not sure if many of you remember that logo, or it might even be before your time, but that was the Exchange 2003 logo. Cool. So let's go through an agenda and what I'm going to talk about today. So we'll go through just a quick refresher, the challenge, the solution, and mail flow. And then I'll go through a deep dive about particular mail flows, message attribution, and the gaps that come up when we set up hybrid around mail flow. So the refresher and the challenge. So migrating to Exchange Online. The challenge is we're trying to make two Exchange environments appear as one, so on-prem and online. What do we want out of doing this? Well, we want it to be a seamless experience to the end user and minimal impact to business operations. And how do we do this? Well, as most of you know, we used the hybrid configuration wizard, and in that it does quite a few things that it configures three major things when it comes to making the two environments appear as one. So the moving parts. Number one, the MRS. So that's basically the mailbox move endpoints. Two, the organization relationship or intra-org connectors, they trust, which allows very busy lookups, alert redirection, mail tips. And then three, the mail flow. So internal/external mail flow and trusted mail flow. So let's talk about mail flow. Internal versus external. What is the difference? So the biggest thing is, well, it's authenticated mail. Internal mail is authenticated. So consider authenticated mail as Outlook because you've signed into your machine or signed into the mailbox. SMTP off when you provide credentials as part of a SMTP command, or an externally secured connector, which you can set up in Exchange to trust or email that comes from a particular IP address. And then when we talk about unauthenticated mail, we talk about mail that generally comes from the internet, or an open relay from, say, a printer, where you just have it send scanned documents. Note that the physical location or origin doesn't really matter. As long as you provide an authentication component, it doesn't matter where the mail actually comes from. So internal versus external. So all mail between two users on-prem or between on-prem and online should always be internal. So mail can be trusted regardless of where they actually are located. So what happens when it's not? External tagging. If you have an external tagging rule, you'll trigger that between users. Spam and phishing filtering. Deals that require sender auth, right? You'll get blocks if a user tries to send an email to a distribution list that doesn't allow it. They'll get a block. Exchange transport rules that specify inside-outside organization, out-of-office responses, and booking internal resources, things like that. It just goes on. So how do we know? We look at the message headers and we look at the Exchange organization auth as and whether or not it comes as internal or anonymous. So what it looks like. Internal, you can see this internal mail. The header is shown as internal, but the big thing here is the display name. You can see the display name doesn't show an email address. And this is where, when it's external, you can see it displays the email address and then the auth as header is anonymous. Cool. So that was the quick refresher. Let's go through the deep dive. Let's go for on-prem, outbound, and inbound to Exchange Online. So in this example, Amy is on-prem and Hien, myself, in the cloud. Amy will send an email to Hien. Hi, how are you? End of message. The email arrives into Exchange on-prem. Exchange on-prem will do its lookup, find out that Hien has a remote target address of the tenant address. Then the send connector outbound to Office 365 is selected. So what Exchange needs to do for mail to be processed as internal? One, the tenant address must be an accepted domain. Two, the cloud services mail enabled parameter on the send connector needs to be set to true, which we can see here. The tenant address is in my listed, it is listed in my accepted domains, and the send connector has cloud services mail enabled is true. What then happens is that Exchange will insert additional headers. So the organization headers that Exchange automatically puts in are now converted to cross-premises headers and then added to the mail before it heads out. We're going to assume that TLS is set up correctly. Mail arrives into EXO. It goes to the tenant address of Hien. So what EXO does now is does message attribution, which I'll be explaining a little later. If the message is found to be originating, all the cross-premises headers that were added as part of the process on-prem are sent across. If cloud services mail enabled is true on the inbound connector in EXO, where the hybrid wizard will set that for you, the cross-premises headers are now promoted to organization headers. So when the email has arrived into EXO, it already has organization headers that EXO has applied to the mail, but then the cross-premises headers that were inside that email are now converted to the organization headers and replaced, and it replaces the original ones. So that's what happens, and then the mail arrives into Hien's mailbox as internal mail. So I'm going to do a demo now. I'll show you guys how it actually works in the behind the scenes. So let me bring up my lab. All right, so this is Amy's mailbox. Let's send an email to you. Actually, no, I need to set up the pipeline tracing. So here, I need to enable the pipeline tracing to grab all the, when the email goes through the transport pipeline, so we can interrogate all the headers and everything that's actually happened to the message. So we'll get transport service, set transport service, pipeline tracing enabled. We want to set that to true. pipeline tracing path. So I'll set one for C drive trace. And then pipeline tracing sender address, which I'll set to Amy. Yeah, so be aware that when you do this, it will export the mail in the pipeline as EML files. So you'll be able to open these emails inside Outlook. So be very careful. Cool. Let's send an email to Hien in the cloud. Send. Make sure the email arrives into Hien's mailbox. There it is. We can see that it's internal because the email address isn't exposed. But if we go into the message headers, we can see it designated as internal. Now, let's have a look at the pipeline trace exports. So if we go to the message snapshots, trace, message snapshots, here are the messages that were sent, or that one single email that was sent. What we want to look at is the routing when it goes through the outbound trust agent. So it's generally the last one. We go into here, we can see that the source is the outbound trust agent. You can see all the organization headers. And then you can see all these cross-premises headers. All these cross-premises headers were added. But what you see is that if you look at this, we can see that they match exactly the same as this, as the organization headers that Exchange put in. Probably should. It's to one side. See that? Is yeah. So they'll all match up. They'll match up exactly the same. And then when the message arrives into EXO, EXO will convert all of these cross-premises headers into the organizational headers, the organization headers. So that's how Exchange Online, or how we do hybrid. I'll also show that when you think about it, when email arrives into Exchange without authentication, it automatically is external, right? But if you try to send an email where the email address is an accepted domain inside Exchange, if it leaves Exchange going to that same email domain, Exchange, well, it obviously makes sense that the cross-premises headers will be added because it's leaving Exchange, but going to a domain that Exchange actually owns. So I'll show another demonstration where I've added hotmail.com as a test into my on-prem environment. It's not in my Office 365 tenant, but if I send a message to hotmail.com, I have a send connector that goes directly outbound to hotmail.com. So S, she has a target address of hotmail.com. Test. Let's have a look at the message. Here, we go to the last routing. And then we can see the cross-premises headers are added. It's because hotmail.com is an accepted domain on-prem, but it's left on-prem, and these cross-premises headers have been added. So what we'll do now is let's break this internal email, and let's go to get send connector. We want first one. We can see cloud services mail enabled is true. So let's set that to false and see what happens. Let's send connector cloud false. Cool. So let's send another mail. Oh, we've set that. Let's go back into the message snapshots. If we look at the last routing for the outbound trust agent, oh, is that correct? I have not set that again. I've been too fast. I believe that is set. Yep. Check. False. Yeah. No. That should be correct. Yeah, that's right. So the cross-purposes headers will still be added, sorry. And then on the other side, the cloud services mail enabled won't transfer that across. So if we go to the mailbox of Hien, we'll be able to see that it's actually broken. Here it is. We can see the email address in the email. And if we go to view, to the view, message details, and if we go into here, we look at the auth as anonymous. So that's how the mail works when we have cloud services mail enabled off on-prem. But what happens if we turn it off in Exchange Online? Let's turn this back on. Yeah. Through. Okay, let me go. Show this. All right, let's get the inbound connector. Fine. One. Failed. So that's set to true. Let's set it to false. cloud services mail enabled is false. This will take, hopefully it should be quick. So let's send another email. It may not work because it does take some time, but let's have a look. Go back to Hien's mailbox. And there it is. We have the email address shown. So the headers weren't promoted. We look at view, message details. We can see author is anonymous. So let's fix this all up. Back into my set exo PowerShell. Set it back to true. Oh. So that's how it works when it's on-prem to online. Fortunately, I can't show, we don't have access to online to show how the headers are promoted, but I've got the next best thing, and that is we'll do it in reverse and we see what on-prem does to the email. So outbound on-prem, inbound exo. So the on-prem send connector, we need to ensure that the correct certificate's being used on the send connector. You can check that in the verbose logs. We need the tenant.mail.onmicrosoft.com domain to be an accepted domain on-prem so that the cross-premises headers are added. And then C, cloud services mail enabled to be true, so those headers can be transferred. And then on the EXO inbound connector, we look for the certificate name used by the above send connector. And then cloud services mail enabled to be true as well. In the GUI, in Exchange Online, that's what that tick box actually does, retain internal Exchange email headers. So that's cloud services mail enabled box. So here's the flow. The organization headers are converted to cross-premises headers and added to the email. Send connector allows the transfers of the new headers. Message attribution occurs in EXO, which will come up as originating. I'll explain it in the next part. New headers are sent on the data command in SMTP comms. EXO then promotes these or converts these cross-premises headers and replaces the initial organization headers. Oh, message attribution. So message attribution, this is a concept that a lot of people don't generally think about, but in a big, large environment like EXO, mailboxes can be sitting anywhere, regardless of which tenant you're in. You don't all sit on a single DAG, you can sit in multiple DAGs, your users can be across hundreds of DAGs. So it can sit on any database server infrastructure. And obviously every tenant has their own sets of rules, like exchange transport rules, right? So we need to organize and assign the mail to a specific tenant. So we call it message attribution. So it's a calculated process to determine who the message actually belongs to and what the purpose of the mail is. The purpose/intent of the mail is whether or not it's organizational mail, so internal mail, versus internet mail. So the idea is coming from a customer into their tenant or going to a customer from an external source. So why is it important? Well, every tenant has their own rules: exchange transport rules, EOP rules, ATP rules, centralized mail flow. We need to apply these settings to mail where when it arrives into EXO. Specific inbound connectors can then be assigned to the message itself. It's obviously important for things like TLS or IP restrictions. And then message trace data can also be assigned to a specific tenant. If you've ever worked in a hosted Exchange on-prem solution where Exchange is for hundreds of clients, separating message trace data is difficult. It's impossible, basically. We need to be able to produce message trace data for your own tenant and not reveal it to other organizations in EXO. So when a mail comes from the cloud on-prem to Exchange Online, what do we do? So Exchange Online, what we do is we check if the email is originating first. So we look at, in the example that I did in the first part, we look for the TLS certificate presented. So in my lab, it was mail.msftexchange.com. The mail from domain is of the email and the recipient domain of the email. Cool. So what Exchange Online does, we get all the inbound connectors of type on-prem with the certificate name matching what was presented. So all the inbound connectors of on-prem, there'll be millions possibly of these. So we've got to find that connector. And then what we do is we look for the certificate subject name or the sender domain is an accepted domain in that tenant where that connector came from. In the GUI, this is what it looks like. When we authenticate sent mail, we verify you specify the TLS send name, and we check if the domain is in your accepted domain list. So in this, we match it up. Looks good. TLS certificate matches, and the mail from domain matches, which means we're good. This will come back passed as originating. But what happens if we didn't use a certificate? We check the connecting server IP, as that's one of the options. So we go, let's look for all inbound connectors of type on-prem with the connecting on-prem server public IP address. That's where it is in the GUI. Check the sender domain mail from is an accepted domain in those tenants that were found with that public address. And then if that is found, we stamp the Exchange organization message directionality header as originating. So in both scenarios, certificate or IP, if they pass, they come back as originating. But what happens if we fail originating? So we now look at it as an incoming mail, so from the internet or from an external source. So in this example, we have Amy sending from her Gmail address. So EXO does a lookup / match for the recipient domain in all accepted domains. So the recipient domain being msftexchange.com. We attribute that mail to the tenant. We then check all the inbound partner connectors on the tenant so that we can enforce any domain or incoming IP or TLS restrictions for that particular domain, and it's attributed to that connector. And then if that fails, it will be attributed to the default internet inbound connector. And then we stamp the message directionality header to be incoming. Cool. So what happens if message attribution fails for both originating and incoming? Well, EXO will reject the mail because it's not an accepted domain when it fails incoming. The mail to recipient domain isn't in Exchange Online, so by default we'll NDR it. We don't own it. Does MA determine if an email is considered Exchange internal? No, it does not. It's only part of the process. Cool. So let's look at the other way now. Inbound on-prem and outbound XO. So Hien replies to the mail. I'm good, thanks. How are you? Goes to XO. Now, what's XO going to do? XO does a lookup. The mail user object with the external address, and then the send connector is selected outbound to on-prem. So for mail to be processed as internal, cloud services mail enable needs to be true on the outbound connector. There's the tick box. Additional headers are then inserted into the email before it is sent. Remember the accepted domain, your domain is in Exchange Online already, so it will add the cross-premises headers. We're going to assume TLS is set up again correctly, because if it's not, the mail is not going to arrive into Exchange. So on-prem, we'll do a receive connector match. Depending on how you've set up your environment, it'll be inbound from Office 365 or use the default front-end connector. So we do a receive connector selection based on the bindings IP port and remote IP ranges. So the selected connector has the TLS domain capabilities of mail.protection@outlook.com, except cloud services mail. We don't have the switch like the send connector does or the inbound connector in Exchange Online. This is what needs to be set. The Hybrid Wizard does this, but it does it to the default connector. There it is. Exchange will now offer an SMTP command called X originating org. XO sends the default mail from the main in the XORG command as part of the mail from SMTP command for on-prem. And what on-prem will do will match that XORG to its list of accepted domains. And if it matches, which it should, because your domains in Exchange Online should match your ones on-prem, Exchange on-prem will then promote those headers, promote the cross-premises headers to organization headers. And then Exchange, Amy will receive the mail. So let's go through that particular scenario. So let's set the transport service. Let's change that to Hien, because Hien's now the sender of the email. Let's reply to that email. So sent. Hope it arrives in Amy's mailbox. There it is. Let's look at the message headers. And here, not the crosstown, the organization ones. Organization author as internal. Oh, so now let's go through the message snapshots. So the original email that arrived into Exchange. So if we look at the original email, we can see these cross-premises headers have come in. And then the organization headers, these are the original ones. Right? So we can see the original email was tagged as anonymous because it's come from Exchange Online, an external source, and it wasn't authenticated. We can see where the auth was done, And then what happens is that when we see these cross-premises headers, Exchange Online converted the organization headers to these cross-premises headers, and it's tagged as internal mail. It's all sources, Exchange Online servers. So from here, what we do is we want to have a look at the inbound trust agent, which is the last one. So here on the inbound trust agent, EML, we can see the cross-premises headers don't exist anymore. This is the original. So the cross-premises headers are not there, but they've been changed over to organization headers. So you see the organization headers are now, the auth as is now internal. So we've converted all the cross-premises headers across the organization headers. So you see the auth source, you see SEO, basically everything that says it is internal mail and that you should treat it as internal mail. The cross-premises headers promoted, what server did it. So let's have a look at what happens when I disable. When I disable the accept cloud services mail enabled on the receive connector. So there's the TLS domain capabilities. Let's null that out. It's nulled. Let's send another email. Let's have a look at the email arrive into the mailbox. There it is. We've got the email address showing, which shows that off as is now anonymous. But let's have a look at the message snapshots, what's actually happened. So we're going to message snapshots. Let's go to the one. This one, the original ones come in. You can see the cross-premises headers were transferred because the cloud mail services enabled is on the send connector and EXO. So they've come across. So it's come across as internal mail. If we go to the inbound trust agent, we can see those headers have now been stripped. They've been taken off because we turned off cloud services mail enabled. And that's how important it is to have these settings correct. Okay. So let's turn it off. Turn it back on, sorry. There it is. Let's turn it off on the send connector in Exchange Online. Yep. Outbound connector 2. Yep. Outbound connector bound. So this is mail enabled is default. Give it a bit of time. Test it. Again with out service mail enabled. So let's check if the mail has come in. Oh, it hasn't been set yet. Give it a couple of minutes. again. No, it hasn't been set. Wait, fortunately. It is set to false. Let's try it again. No, not yet. Okay, let's leave that for a bit. While that's happening, I'll come back to this, give it a couple of minutes. So I'll continue with the slides and I'll go back to that. So outbound XO to inbound on-prem. So XO outbound, once again, we need cloud services mail enabled to be true. The TLS certificate named from on-prem on that connector. The accepted domains already in XO. And then two, the on-prem receive connector. We want to make sure that the correct certificate is being used by the receive connector. You can set that directly on the receive connector, or if you change the FQDN on the receive connector to match your certificate. And B, the TLS domain capabilities need to be set to that. So the process, the organization headers are converted to cross-premises headers and added. The outbound connector has CSME enabled to be CSME to be true. Headers are sent. The on-prem receive connector has TLS domain capabilities set to that. The cross-premises headers are converted back to organization headers and replace the original ones. Cool. So let's go back to the lab. Let's see if it's been set now. Test. No, I haven't done it. Haven't you done it? Let's just leave that because it's been set. Exchange. Ah, actually, I think I might know why. I know it's on the outbound. Okay, let's just leave that and I'll come back to that at the end. It's just taking some time for XO to apply that. Okay, so let's talk about securing the gaps. Because once we set up hybrid, there are a few holes that are opened when we set up hybrid. So when your MX is pointed to the on-prem, that's your on-prem Exchange environment, we now set up hybrid with your tenant. And so what happens is that now we have holes where email can be delivered straight into the tenant. Even though your MX is pointed on-prem, we can use the Exchange Online smart host address and direct all emails to directly to the tenant or via the onmicrosoft.com address. What also opens up is that now, because there is generally a firewall between your on-prem environment and online, other tenants now have the ability to send directly to your on-prem environment by this, your smart host address. And then when your MX is pointed to Exchange Online. So So when another tenant sends an email directly to Exchange on-prem environment, the mail will not be considered internal. Why is that? It's even though we have hybrid, we have the TLS certificate and cloud mail services enabled is true. The cross-premises headers are not sent because the recipient domain is not an accepted domain in the tenant. So they'll be able to send mail directly to Exchange environment, but because it's not there in their list of accepted domains in their own tenant, those headers are not set. So let's talk about X originating org. And this is what Exchange on-prem uses to trust Exchange online. So when we do the enable TLS domain capabilities on-prem on your receive connectors, we can see in the verbose logging that its capabilities are listed. And then as part of the email, the mail from command, we can see that where the originating email came from. It's come originating from your tenant, even if it's external, regardless whether it's internal or external mail, it's come from your tenant, from your default domain. And in this case, it's msftexchange.com. Even if it comes from Gmail, it's because it's landed in your tenant that your tenant goes, you own this mail, so you're the originating org. So if it's come from another tenant, it will have a different domain listed in XORG. So this is how it's enabled. XO reports the XORG domain in the SMTP mail from. On-prem will then get that XORG and match it to your accepted domains on-prem. And if there's a match, the cross-premises headers are then promoted. Then the X originator org is also stamped in the stamped with the accepted/default tenant domain. There it is, set mail item org to msftexchange.com. So securing the gaps. Two gaps are exposed when you have hybrid. One is the direct delivery to the tenant by the on Microsoft domains or the Exchange Online Smart Host address. And then two, direct delivery into the on-prem environment for any email that originates from XO. And it's less known as the first one, but because it requires a sender to know your edge IP address, but that's not terribly hard to do. You can just query the DNS address of a domain. And generally a lot of organizations would use 0365 SMTPN, for example, as a DNS address. So direct delivery, how do we block this? So your MX is on-prem, but you're getting direct delivery into XO. So what we do is we create a new inbound connector. The connector type will be partner with all sender domains. So any domain, we require TLS to be true. So then any email that arrives into Exchange Online require the use of certificate. We restrict the domains to the certificate. We set the TLS sender certificate name to be whatever subject you want it to be. Generally, it will be, in my example here, it will be block non-mx.domain.com. And that's what I've used, and you'll get a block. So for on-prem direct delivery from XO, scenario 2, your MX is pointed to XO. XO appends the header X originating org on-prem, which we can use to only accept emails from our own tenant. So here's the transport rule. The X originating org is set to your default domains or any of your and your default tenant domain. But remember that this is for all emails that are not authenticated, because it's listed as outside the organization. So if you have an open relay on-prem or say your printers or your MFDs, those sort of devices, then you also need to add IP addresses as an exception, which is where we come up to the third scenario, is where your MX is pointed on-prem. So the rule that we just spoke about will not work because we need an additional match. So where your emails are going to be coming from, whether it's a load balancer IP, a firewall IP, or possibly your third-party filtering service IP. So we add a message header where the sender IP address range is maybe your internal domain plus your maybe an external IP address or your firewall IP address. So that way it will be allowed into the environment. So let's go back to my demonstration because hopefully it's now been set. Okay. Start it again. This. Quickly test this again. Yes. Last time. Hopefully this works. Send. Amy receive it. There it is. So now it's come in with the email address listed. We go to view message details. We want the organization headers and author as is anonymous, which says it's external mail. So let's go through the headers in the transport pipeline. So we look at the original. We can see the cross-premises headers were not transferred. They're not listed there. It's only the cross-tenant ones and the original organization ones. So by turning off CSME in the outbound connector in Exchange Online, the headers are not transferred, so they're not there. So Exchange on-prem can't promote them. So key takeaways and tools. So 1, please make sure your certificates are correct. Make sure the right ones are used and the SANs match in your connectors. Cross-premises headers appear when an email goes outside of Exchange boundary, when it is an accept domain. File services mail enabled to be true everywhere, and the receive connector to have the same setting, but in the TLS domain capabilities. Message attribution and understanding what Xorg does. Secure your environment. Gaps are open when you enable hybrid. It's relatively an easy fix with transport rules. And tools. So pipeline tracing, as I enabled in my environment. The message header analyzer tool, which the majority of Exchange admins would have used. Verbose logging to have a look at what's happening in the SMTP communications in the receive and send connector, and message trace detail in Xorg. Cool, thank you. I know it was a long session. I've taken nearly the full hour, but there's still 5 minutes to go, I think. I see there's a hand up from Thorsten. I think that's how I say it. Yep, Thorsten.
Hey, sorry to interrupt here. We're actually over time by a few minutes.
Oh.
We'll have to wrap the session right here and carry on with any Q&A in the chat for from here on out. Thanks so much for everyone for joining us today. Any closing comments, Hien?
No, but thank you everyone for your time. I know there was a lot of content. I tried to squeeze it in as quick as I could. It was a bit sad that the lab took a bit of time, but that's what it is with dealing with Exchange Online. But I hope that gave you guys insights about how we do hybrid mail flow. It's actually quite interesting, and have a great rest of the day to all of you.